I used to think the scar on my leg was the most painful thing I carried home from Iraq. The limp I live with, the ache that settles in when the weather changes, the nights when pain jolts me awake. But that scar was nothing compared to the wound I could never show anyone. The wound carved not by enemy fire, but by the people who sat across from me at my own dinner table for more than 20 years, my family. That truth did not come to me all at once. It was not the kind of pain that explodes in a single moment. It was slower, colder, creeping in through the cracks of my life until one day I realized the worst betrayal I would ever know had not happened on a battlefield. It had happened in my own home. I tell you this now as a veteran, standing before you at a ceremony meant to honor service and sacrifice. The hall was filled with uniforms that morning, the smell of polished brass, the sound of boots against tile. The applause rose like thunder as I walked to the stage. They placed the Bronze Star Medal in my hands, a symbol of that night in Basra when I pulled two brothers in arms out of the fire. I should have felt pride. I should have felt whole. Instead, a storm churned inside me, because medals can honor courage, but they cannot erase betrayal. They cannot silence the memory of opening letters from home. Words written in what I thought was love, but carried secrets that would eventually cost lives. Secrets that should never have left the desert. Secrets that somehow made their way into hands that wanted nothing more than to see us bleed. In that moment, as cameras flashed and strangers shook my hand, I knew I could not keep my silence. Honor, loyalty, sacrifice. Those are the lessons I carried from my years in uniform. And yet it was inside the walls of my own house that I faced the greatest treachery of my life. That is the story I am going to share with you here. A story that reads like crime but was carved out of family ties. A story of betrayal that almost broke me and of the resilience that helped me rise again. Stay with me until the end. If you believe that the truth can cut deeper than any battlefield wound, then this story will matter to you. And if you want to stand beside me as I honor the quiet battles of those who have served, hit the like button and subscribe to Military Revenge. Because this is not just my story. It is a story about what it means to be loyal when loyalty costs everything. It is a story about how justice finds its way even in the darkest corners of betrayal. I was born into a house where silence spoke louder than words. My mother believed silence kept the peace. My father believed silence was the way to remind us who held the power. And my older brother Mark used silence like a weapon, turning it into ridicule wrapped in smirks and raised eyebrows. For a long time, I thought that was normal, that families were meant to feel like battlefields long before you ever saw a real one. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, a place where coal dust still clung to the air even though the mines had been dying for decades. My father, Henry, worked those mines until his back gave out. He wore his bitterness like a second skin. When I was little, I used to watch him clean the dirt from under his nails at the sink, his face hardened into something I could never reach. To him, the world was divided into the strong and the weak, the useful and the useless. And in his eyes, I was born into the wrong half. Mark, my brother, was the son he wanted. At least that was what I believed when I was a girl. Mark was loud, brash, full of charm when he wanted to be, and lazy when it came to everything else. He could do no wrong. If he skipped school, Dad called him a wild spirit. If I got straight A's, Dad muttered that books were for dreamers. He told me once, "You'll never make it in a man's world. You're too soft, too breakable." The words stuck like splinters. Even as I worked twice as hard to prove him wrong. I learned early that no matter what I did, I would never be enough, not in that house, not for them. So when I turned 18, I signed the enlistment papers without telling anyone. I remember the recruiter's pen in my hand, the paper trembling under my fingers. It felt like the first real decision of my life, the first breath of freedom. Of course, when my father found out, he laughed, a laugh without warmth, without even a hint of surprise. He said the army was no place for girls, that I would be broken in a week. Mark chimed in, calling me private little sister, a joke he carried for years. There is a peculiar kind of fire that comes when the people who are supposed to love you most are the first to doubt you. That fire burned in me through boot camp. Every mile I ran, every push-up on blistered palms, every night I lay awake in a bunk listening to other recruits snore. I carried their words like weight on my back. And when I graduated, when I stood in my uniform with my spine straight, I almost wished my father had been there to see it. But he wasn't. He never came. What he did come for years later was the day I returned home limping. My leg was never the same after Basra. The scar ran from my thigh to my knee, an ugly reminder of the night an IED lit the road under us like hell opening. I walked into that house with a cane and instead of pride. I saw the smirk on Mark's face and the glint in my father's eyes. He called me what I had feared all along, a failure. It is hard to explain to someone who has never worn the uniform what it feels like to be called weak after surviving the impossible, to have your courage dismissed by the very blood that raised you. It does something to the soul. It hollows you out, leaves you carrying medals in one hand and shame in the other. Even now, when I think back on those days, I can see myself at the kitchen table, the same table where I once did homework as a child. My cane leaned against the chair, the house smelling faintly of my mother's pot roast. Mark sat across from me, a beer in his hand, saying I should have stayed home, worked in town like normal people. Dad nodded as if that was the wisest thing ever spoken. And my mother kept her eyes down, spooning potatoes as if pretending not to hear would erase the sting. That was the foundation of everything that followed. The contempt, the dismissals, the constant reminder that in their eyes I was never good enough. That contempt would later twist into something darker, something that would cost not just pride, but lives. You might wonder why I stayed close, why I kept going back to that house when every bone in me wanted to run. The answer is complicated. And maybe you will understand if you have ever loved people who could not love you back the way you needed. Family is a stubborn bond. It keeps you tethered long after the rope should have snapped. Still, there was a part of me that hoped, against all reason, that one day they would see me not as the girl who failed in their eyes, but as the woman who stood her ground. Hope can be cruel that way. It keeps you holding on, even as the floor beneath you begins to crack. Looking back, the signs were there, the bitter comments, the casual disdain, the silence at every milestone I achieved. They did not celebrate my victories, because to celebrate would mean admitting they were wrong about me. And Henry Carter was never wrong, at least not in his own mind. What he never realized was that the army had given me more than scars. It had given me strength. It had given me a new definition of family, one built not on blood but on loyalty. It had shown me that survival is not about who laughs the loudest, but who keeps standing when the smoke clears. But in that house, none of that mattered. To them, I was still the girl who should have stayed in her place. That belief became the soil where betrayal grew. And when it bloomed, it carried a poison I never imagined I would taste. Sometimes the worst wars are the ones no one sees, the ones fought behind closed doors with words sharper than knives. That was my first war long before Iraq, and it never really ended. If you are hearing this, know that what I am sharing is not only about me. It is about every soldier who returned home only to find another kind of battle waiting. It is about how easily love can turn into envy, how quickly pride can twist into resentment. This is not just my family's story. It is a story I know others will recognize in their own way. And if you stay with me through this journey, you will see how those words and those wounds became the opening act in a tragedy that unfolded like a slow burn, until everything I thought I knew about loyalty, trust, and blood was torn apart. There are moments burned into memory not because they were grand, but because they were small and cruel. I remember the night after I came back from Walter Reed, still in recovery, still learning how to walk without dragging my bad leg. My father poured himself a glass of bourbon and leaned back in his chair, watching me limp across the room. He smirked and said that maybe now I would finally understand that women did not belong where men fought. My brother laughed and clinked his bottle against my father's glass as if they were toasting to my failure. My mother, always the quiet one, busied herself with folding towels, refusing to look at me. That silence cut deeper than their words. That was the house I returned to, the place where I was supposed to heal. The truth is, I never healed there. You cannot patch wounds in a place that keeps ripping them open. My room still smelled faintly of the girl I used to be. The posters on the wall, the stack of books on the shelf, but I no longer belonged in that space. I had seen too much, lost too much, to fit back into the skin of the daughter they remembered, and yet they never tried to see who I had become. I tell you this not to paint myself as a victim, but to lay bare the soil in which betrayal grew, because betrayal rarely comes out of nowhere. It grows where contempt has already taken root, where envy festers unchecked. My father and brother resented that I had stepped into a world they considered theirs, and worse, that I had returned with proof of my courage. The medal I carried home should have been a symbol of survival. To them, it was only another reminder that I had dared to defy their expectations. There is a saying we learned in training: pain is weakness leaving the body. But no one ever tells you what to do when the pain comes from people you cannot fight. I could face insurgents in Iraq, IEDs hidden on dusty roads, nights filled with mortar fire. But there was no manual for sitting across from your own family, listening to them dismiss the blood you shed as nothing more than foolishness. And yet I stayed. I stayed because hope is a stubborn thing. I stayed because part of me believed that if I just kept showing up, kept proving my worth, one day they would see me. Maybe you understand that kind of hope. Maybe you know what it feels like to keep knocking on a door that never opens. There were rare moments that almost fooled me. A Sunday dinner when my father actually asked how my leg was healing. A Christmas morning when Mark gave me a scarf, muttering that it would keep me warm if I ever went back to that desert. Small mercies that felt like cracks of light through heavy clouds, but they never lasted. Within days, the comments returned, sharper than before, reminding me that whatever kindness they offered was fleeting. I think about my mother often in those years. She was not cruel the way my father and brother were. She was absent in a different way, a silence that spoke of surrender. She once told me after everyone else had gone to bed that she envied me for leaving. She said she never had the courage to walk away. It was the closest thing to an apology I ever heard from her. The truth is, I was not the failure they saw, but in that house, perception was everything. And perception became the lens through which betrayal would later make sense to them. They could justify what they did because, in their eyes, I had already failed. And what is one more failure if it means survival for the family? That was their logic, twisted, but in their minds it was survival. Looking back, the warnings were everywhere. The casual way my father asked questions about deployment. The way Mark pressed me for stories, pretending he was interested in my life, when really he wanted details that no soldier should share. I told myself they were just curious, just trying to connect in their own clumsy way. I never suspected that those questions were seeds being collected, ready to be sold when the time was right. Even now, years later, I replay those conversations in my mind. The way Mark's eyes narrowed when I mentioned base locations. The way my father nodded when I spoke about supply shortages, as if tucking it away for later. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Soldiers talk to their families. We write letters, send emails, share what little pieces of our lives we can. But there is a line every one of us is trained never to cross: operational security. OPSEC, loose lips sink ships. We all learned it, and yet somehow those lines blurred for me. Maybe because I wanted to believe my family cared enough to listen. When I brought home the limp and the scar, I also brought home the invisible weight of survivor's guilt. I carried names in my heart, men and women who never came back. And to be dismissed in that house, to be mocked by the very people I thought would stand by me, it hollowed me out. That hollowness left me vulnerable to their manipulation, vulnerable to believing that sharing small details was harmless. I see it now for what it was, the first cracks in a wall that should never have been breached. What I did not realize then was that contempt can be more dangerous than open hatred. Contempt erodes trust, it wears down vigilance. It convinces you to second-guess yourself. That is what happened to me. I began second-guessing everything. Was I overreacting when I felt their disdain? Was I imagining the sharpness in their questions? Was I foolish to think my family might one day be proud of me? Those doubts were the perfect cover for what they would later do. There is something else you should know. Betrayal rarely begins with a grand act. It begins with small choices, excuses made in quiet corners. My father once told me that in this world you do what you must to survive. I thought he was talking about the mines, about the years of grinding work that broke his body. I never knew he was laying down the philosophy that would guide him when the chance to trade loyalty for money came along. And Mark, he had always been jealous, though he would never say it aloud. Jealous that I left, that I built a life outside the shadow of that house. Jealous that I wore a uniform and came home with medals, even if they mocked them. To him, those medals were proof that I had done what he never could. And envy, when mixed with desperation, can be deadly. At the time, I was too busy trying to rebuild myself to see the storm brewing. I spent my days at physical therapy, pushing my body past its limits, forcing my leg to carry me when it wanted to give out. I spent my nights haunted by dreams of Basra. The explosion, the screams, the choking dust. My world was already fractured, and in that fracture, I missed the signs. Maybe that is why I tell you all of this, because hindsight is cruel but clear. I can trace every word, every gesture, every smirk, and see them now for what they were: warnings, red flags, but at the time they were just the rhythm of life in that house. And I was too worn down, too desperate for acceptance, to recognize that the people I wanted most to trust would become the ones to destroy me. You might think betrayal comes like thunder, sudden and loud. Sometimes it does. But more often, it comes like a slow lake, drop by drop, until one day you realize the floor has rotted beneath you. That was my life in that house. Every laugh at my expense, every dismissal of my service, every mocking word. It was the slow leak, and by the time the flood came, it was already too late. I share this because you need to understand the foundation of what came next. You need to see how the stage was set long before the curtain rose. I was not just a soldier facing enemies abroad. I was a daughter facing enemies at home, hidden behind familiar faces. And that is why the betrayal, when it came, cut so deep. There are many kinds of scars. Some you can trace with your fingers. Others live in the silence after a cruel laugh, in the space left empty where love should have been. Those are the scars I carried into the next chapter of my life. And those scars shaped every choice I would make when the truth finally came crashing down. If you are still with me, keep listening, because the wound I am describing now was only the beginning. The real story was still waiting, sharp and merciless, just around the corner. And when it arrived, it would shake not only my life, but everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and survival. War has a way of shrinking the world. Days blur into nights, the desert heat turns into cold that cuts through bone, and the only tether to home comes in the form of words on a page. Letters, emails, scraps of connection. When I was in Iraq, those letters were lifelines. I wrote them late at night under the yellow light of a lamp, sometimes huddled in a tent, sometimes perched on the edge of a cot with my boots still on. I told myself I was writing to keep my family close, to remind myself that home still existed somewhere far from the sand and the fire. I told them about the weather, about the endless meals of MREs, about the way sand found its way into every crease of my gear. I told them about the friends I made, the laughter we found in the darkest places, the nights we stayed awake playing cards until dawn. I never thought I was crossing a line. I never thought simple details could matter to anyone beyond the walls of that house. But lines are not always as clear as we think. I would write about convoys leaving base at dawn, not realizing how even a time of day could matter. I would mention shortages of water or fuel, believing I was only sharing my frustrations. I would describe the long hours on patrol, the endless stretches of desert that blurred into one another. And my family, they always asked questions. How far did we travel? What towns did we pass through? How often did we see contact? I thought it was curiosity. Looking back, I see it for what it was. They were collecting. The emails were worse, faster, more immediate. I would log into the computer center, typing with dusty fingers, desperate for a few minutes of connection. My brother Mark was always the one who wrote back first. He asked the most questions. I brushed it off as his way of showing interest, maybe even pride, though he never said it. My father rarely replied. But when he did, his words were sharp, filled with advice I never asked for. Be careful, do not trust anyone, and always remember that family comes first. At the time, I thought he meant he cared. I see it differently now. There was one letter in particular that still haunts me. I had written about a mission outside Basra. I did not give specifics, at least not in my mind. I only mentioned that we were running more night patrols, that tension was high, that something big felt close. A week later, the ambush came. It was too precise, too well timed. We lost good people that night. I walked away with a scar. Others did not walk away at all. I never imagined that the words I sent home could have been part of that chain. It was not until much later, long after I had returned, that the pieces began to connect. The military police showed up with questions. Had I shared certain details? Did I speak openly about routes or times? I felt the ground shift under me as they laid out their suspicions. Information had been sold. Information that had come from someone too close to me. At first, I denied it. I swore I had not shared anything that mattered. But then they showed me copies of my own emails. Words I had typed without thinking, sentences I had sent into the ether believing they would land in safe hands. Seeing them on paper, pulled out of context, I understood how dangerous they had been. And I understood something worse. If the investigators had these letters, so did someone else, someone who had paid for them. That realization nearly broke me. I could not comprehend that my family, my own blood, might have handed over pieces of my life for money, and yet the trail pointed straight back to them. My brother's sudden new truck, my father's unexplained cash, the way they always seemed to know more about my deployment than I ever told them aloud. It was all there in plain sight, and I had been too blind to see. The guilt was crushing. Every night I replayed the moment I pressed send. The moment I folded a letter and sealed the envelope. I thought I was giving them love, connection, proof that I was still alive. In reality, I had been giving them ammunition. Ammunition they would pass on to people who used it against us. I started to question everything. Did my words kill my friends? Did my letters draw the map that led insurgents to our convoys? Was my need for love and acceptance the reason coffins draped in flags came home? These are questions that have no answer, and yet they echo in me even now. I share this because it matters, because betrayal does not always come with a knife in the dark. Sometimes it comes with a letter written in your own hand, a letter you thought was harmless. And sometimes the people who should protect you are the very ones who use your trust as currency. This is where the story begins to turn. This is where the cracks in my family's love widened into chasms. You may think you know how far betrayal can go, but what I uncovered in the months ahead would make even those suspicions feel small. If this unsettles you, hold on. The story only grows heavier, sharper, and more dangerous from here. And yet, through that danger came clarity. Through that betrayal came the strength to see myself not as their failure, but as something far greater. The investigation did not end with my letters, it began with them. Military police traced patterns, timelines, and money trails. At first, they told me very little. I was a witness, not a suspect, but the weight of their questions pressed on me like an accusation. Did you tell them about convoy movements? Did you ever mention the name of your commanding officer? Did you describe base layouts, guard rotations, or the timing of patrols? Each question was a blade, cutting through my memories, forcing me to relive every word I had sent home. I swore I never shared classified details. I believed that to be true, but they explained how intelligence works. Even small pieces, scattered and harmless on their own, can be assembled into a picture. A soldier writes that the chow hall is running low on supplies. Another mentions that the motor pool is busy at night. Another talks about fewer helicopters flying overhead. To an enemy trained in patterns, these scraps become a blueprint. And I had given my family plenty of scraps. The officers did not accuse me directly, but they did not hide their suspicions either. They believed someone in my family had passed information to contractors with questionable ties, men who in turn fed those details into networks far beyond American soil. I listened in silence, my throat dry, my hands trembling. Each word they spoke drove a wedge deeper into me, because deep down I already knew who it must have been. My father had never forgiven me for enlisting. He called it a waste, said I was chasing glory that did not exist. My brother Mark mocked me endlessly, reminding me that no medal could make me his equal. My mother, quiet as always, had stayed in the shadows, offering no defense but no cruelty either. But all of them had access to my letters. All of them read my words, my details, my truths. And somehow those details had slipped beyond the safety of our walls. The shame of it followed me everywhere. I stopped sleeping. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for the exact moment I had betrayed without knowing. I remembered sitting in the desert, pouring myself into a letter, trying to bridge the miles with ink and paper. And now, realizing those letters may have paved the way for ambushes that killed my friends. I felt like I had handed a loaded weapon to the enemy myself. One night, after another round of questioning, I sat alone in my quarters. I stared at the bronze star folded neatly in its case, the one they had given me for saving lives in Basra. My chest tightened with the thought that I might have caused other lives to be lost. What kind of honor was that? What kind of soldier was I? But the military did not lay the blame on me. They kept pushing toward the source. Their investigators discovered money transfers into accounts connected to my father. They found records of meetings with a man working for a contracting firm already flagged for misconduct. They pieced together a pattern that pointed not to me, but to the people I trusted most. When I finally confronted my family, the silence in the room was deafening. My father's face was stone, unreadable. Mark shifted in his chair, defensive before I even spoke. My mother's hands twisted in her lap, pale and trembling. I asked them outright, "Did you use my letters? Did you sell the words I sent you? Did you trade my life and the lives of my friends for money?" My father denied it at first, then grew angry, his voice sharp. He said I was imagining things, letting the military fill my head with lies. Mark laughed bitterly, asked how much a few complaints about the desert could really matter. My mother said nothing at all. Her silence told me more than their words ever could. That was the night the fracture became permanent. I walked out of that house with a hollow chest, carrying a truth too heavy for anyone to bear. They had not confessed, but they had not denied it either. And in that absence of love, I saw their betrayal as clearly as if they had signed their names on a contract. The tragedy was not only in what they had done, but in what it cost. My unit had lost soldiers to ambushes that might have been prevented. Families had buried their sons and daughters. And I had to live knowing the roots of that betrayal traced back to my own blood. It is a strange thing to lose your family while they are still alive. Grief without death is its own kind of torment. I carried that grief into every corner of my life. The empty seat at Christmas, the silence of a phone that never rang, the absence of people who were supposed to stand by me. But worse than the absence was the knowledge that they had been present all along, watching, waiting, and still choosing to betray. Sometimes I think about those letters. I wonder if my words are still out there, folded in some file, marked as intelligence. I wonder if men on the other side of the world ever read them aloud, piecing together my life like a puzzle. The thought makes my skin crawl, but it also reminds me of the cost of trust misplaced. This chapter of my story is not one of triumph. It is not about victory or medals. It is about the wound that never healed, the wound that came not from shrapnel but from blood ties. And yet, even in that wound, I found something I had never expected. I found clarity. Because once you have seen betrayal at its deepest, you begin to understand the true value of loyalty. Once you have been cut by the people you trusted most, you recognize the rare and sacred gift of those who remain faithful. And once you realize your own words can be turned into weapons, you learn the power of silence, of strength, of choosing carefully where you place your faith. That was the lesson the deadly letters gave me. It was a lesson that carved itself into my soul, one I carry with me even now. And as the story continues, you will see how those lessons shaped every choice I made from that day forward. Because betrayal, once uncovered, is not the end. It is only the beginning. If you feel the weight of what I have shared, stay close. The path ahead reveals truths darker still, and yet it also reveals the light I never thought I would find. And if this story resonates with you, remember to support military revenge. Every like and subscribe helps these hidden voices be heard. The day of the ceremony was supposed to be one of the proudest of my life. The Bronze Star Medal is not handed out lightly. It is pinned onto soldiers who have shown courage under fire, who have risked their lives for others. In Basra, I had done just that. When the ambush came, when bullets split the night and fire lit the sky, I pulled two brothers out from the wreckage. I dragged them across sand soaked with blood, ignoring the searing pain in my leg, ignoring the voice inside me that said I would not make it. For that, they gave me the medal. For that, the army called me a hero. I stood backstage, straightening my uniform with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit. The scar beneath the fabric burned as if reminding me of the cost. Around me, officers waited with crisp composure, their polished shoes gleaming beneath the lights. I thought of my comrades, some gone, some scarred forever. And I promised myself that this honor was not mine alone. It was theirs too. The announcer called my name. The hall erupted in applause. I stepped into the light, the weight of hundreds of eyes following me as I crossed the stage. A general placed the medal in my hands, then pinned it against my chest. He spoke of bravery, loyalty, sacrifice. The words rang hollow inside me, though I forced myself to smile. Cameras flashed. The crowd rose. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe in pride, and then the air shifted. From the side of the hall, two men in plain clothes walked forward. Their faces were not the faces of celebration. They carried no applause, only silence heavy enough to press the room into stillness. I knew their look before they spoke. "SID, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division." My stomach tightened, my pulse quickened. The officer at the podium faltered as the men stepped up beside him. One of them carried a folder thick with documents. He leaned into the microphone, his voice measured, official. What he said shattered the ceremony like glass. The Carter family, he announced, was under active investigation for the unauthorized transfer of sensitive military information. Documents and evidence indicated ties to foreign contractors, possible treasonous activity. The hall gasped as one. I felt the weight of 100 eyes cut into me like knives. From the roar of applause to the hush of suspicion, the shift was instant and brutal. I stood frozen on stage, my new medal burning against my chest as the officer's words echoed through the hall. The Carter family, my family. It was as if the ground disappeared beneath me. The applause that had carried me forward now turned to silence that caged me in. Officers shifted in their seats, some whispering, others staring openly. Civilians in the audience pulled out phones, capturing the moment, broadcasting my humiliation beyond the walls of the hall. I was no longer the hero who had saved lives in Basra. I was the daughter of traitors. I wanted to speak, to shout that I had not known, that I had never intended harm, but my voice caught in my throat. What words could I offer that would not sound like excuses? The medal that had just been pinned on me felt suddenly like a weight dragging me down, proof of honor tangled with disgrace. The CID agents did not touch me, did not remove me from the stage. But their presence was louder than any handcuffs. They opened the folder, displaying documents that bore my family's name. Transfers, communications, details traced back to the letters I had written. I could not breathe, I could not move. I was trapped in the cruelest twist of fate, honored and condemned in the same breath. I scanned the audience. I saw faces I knew, comrades who had fought beside me. Their eyes held confusion, pity, even suspicion. I wanted to beg them to believe me. I wanted to tell them that I was not my father, not my brother, not the people who had twisted my trust into betrayal. But I said nothing. Silence was my only shield. The general who had pinned the medal on me stood stiffly beside me. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. I wondered if he regretted shaking my hand only moments earlier. I wondered if he believed I had been complicit. The uncertainty was worse than outright accusation. That night, when the ceremony was supposed to end with handshakes and photographs, I left alone, my uniform heavy on my shoulders. The streets outside the hall were quiet, but I felt eyes on me everywhere. In that moment, I understood what it meant to carry a family's sins on your back. There is a cruelty in public humiliation that cuts deeper than private shame. To be called a hero one moment and linked to treason the next is a whiplash that leaves scars invisible to the eye. The whispers followed me long after the applause died. Hero, traitor, which one was I? The truth was I was neither. I was something more complicated. I was a soldier who had given everything to protect my country. I was a daughter betrayed by her own blood, and now I was a woman standing at the crossroads of honor and disgrace, with the world watching and waiting to see which way I would fall. What happened that day was more than an announcement. It was the breaking point. The moment when my private nightmare became public, when the shadow of betrayal swallowed every ounce of light. But it was also the beginning of something else. The moment when I realized that I could no longer carry the weight of their sins in silence. Because medals can be tarnished, names can be stained, but truth has a way of surviving even the darkest storms. If you have followed me this far, you know the pain of betrayal runs deep. But what comes next will show you just how far a family's treachery can reach and how one soldier's resolve can fight against it. Keep listening. Because the darkest secrets were only just beginning to surface. When the ceremony ended, I did not walk out into applause or celebration. I walked out into a tunnel of silence. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, though the spring evening should have been warm. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the echo of boots on pavement behind me. I pulled the medal from my chest and shoved it into my pocket. The sharp pins scratched my palm, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was still alive, still breathing. Even if my reputation had just been gutted. Outside the hall, a few reporters had gathered, tipped off faster than I could have imagined. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust into my face. Was it true? Did I know? Had I been involved? I said nothing. My silence was spun into guilt before my eyes, their pens scribbling accusations as if they were facts. One headline later would call me the fallen hero. Another would question whether I had earned the Bronze Star at all. I learned quickly that silence has a cost, but words once spoken can cost far more. That night, back in the small apartment the army had provided me, I sat in the dark. The medal lay on the table, its bronze face catching what little light seeped through the blinds. I stared at it until the lines blurred. I thought about the faces of the men I had pulled from fire, about the weight of their bodies on my shoulders, about the heat of the explosion that had seared itself into my leg. That medal was proof of something real, and yet in a single evening it had been tainted by shadows I had not cast. Sleep did not come. My mind replayed the ceremony on a loop. The gasp of the crowd, the eyes of my comrades, the voice of the agent as he spoke my family's name into the microphone. I felt again the ground disappearing beneath me, the shift from applause to suspicion. I pressed my hands against my ears as if I could silence the memory. But it clung to me like smoke. The next morning, the army called me in. I sat across from the general who had pinned the medal on me less than 24 hours earlier. His face was grave, his words measured. He told me I was not under arrest. He told me I had not been stripped of the Bronze Star, but he also told me that trust was fragile, and for now I was to keep a low profile. Appearances mattered. The investigation would run its course. And until then, the shadow of suspicion would follow me everywhere. I left his office with my head held high, but inside I was unraveling. Soldiers I passed in the hallway avoided my eyes. Some offered stiff nods, polite but distant. Others turned away altogether. Rumors spread faster than truth, and I was already painted with my family's sins. It was a punishment harsher than any cell, to walk through the world marked by disgrace I had not earned. Days turned into weeks. The story spread beyond the base, beyond the town, into national headlines. News anchors debated my name, my service, my honor. Some defended me, pointing to my record, to my actions in Basra. Others tore me apart, asking how much I had known, whether I had been a willing participant. My photograph, once printed beside words like bravery and sacrifice, now appeared beside words like treason and betrayal. I learned then how quickly a nation can turn on its heroes. One moment you are held up as a symbol of courage. The next, you are dragged through the mud. Your name whispered with suspicion in living rooms across America. The weight of that judgment is heavier than any rucksack I ever carried. But the harshest judgment came not from strangers, but from those I considered my brothers and sisters in arms. One afternoon, I entered the mess hall, conversations hushed. A table of young privates glanced at me, then quickly looked away. A sergeant I had once trained with stood and left without a word. The isolation pressed down on me until I could barely eat. I left my tray untouched and walked out into the sunlight, though it offered no warmth. Still, I refused to break. Each night I reminded myself of the truth. I had not betrayed my country. I had not sold out my brothers. My family had. That distinction mattered, even if the world refused to see it. I clung to it like a lifeline. It was during those nights of silence that I began to write again. Not letters this time, but journal entries. Words no one else would read. I poured out my anger, my grief, my shame. I wrote about the faces of my comrades, about the funerals I had attended, about the weight of betrayal. Writing became my anchor, a way to remind myself that my story was more than the headlines, more than the whispers. It was mine. One evening, as I walked back from the commissary, I overheard two officers talking. They did not know I was within earshot. One said my name with contempt. The other said something worse. He said, "Once a family is rotten, the rot runs through every branch." I froze in place, the words sinking into me like ice. That was how they saw me now. Not as Evelyn Carter, soldier, survivor, Bronze Star recipient, but as Evelyn Carter, daughter of traitors, tainted by blood I did not choose. That night I sat in my apartment and stared at the medal again. I thought about throwing it out the window, about mailing it back, about burning it to ash, but I could not, because that medal was not theirs. It was mine. It belonged to the men I had saved, to the blood I had spilled, to the courage I had summoned in the darkest night of my life. My family's betrayal could not erase that. The weeks stretched on, each one heavier than the last, and then came the summons. CID wanted me to testify. They wanted me to stand in a room and speak aloud the truth I had carried in silence. They wanted me to face the evidence, to confront the betrayal not in whispers, but in words that would echo in official records forever. I stared at the paper in my hands, my pulse thundering. This was the moment I had dreaded and the moment I had longed for. the moment when silence would no longer be my shield, the moment when truth would finally have its voice. And as I folded the summons, as I pressed it flat against the table beside the metal, I understood something I had not seen before. This was no longer about my family. This was about me, about whether I would let their sins define me or whether I would rise above them. Scarred but unbroken, the road ahead would not be easy. Testifying would mean reliving every word, every letter, every betrayal. It would mean standing in the harshest light with no shadows left to hide in. But it would also mean reclaiming my name. And that, I realized, was worth any cost. Because honor can be buried beneath lies, but it cannot be destroyed. It waits, patient and steadfast, for the moment it can rise again. If you are hearing my story now, know this. The ceremony may have ended in disgrace, but the battle for truth was only beginning. And what came next would test not just my loyalty, but the very core of who I was. The night I went back to the Carter house, I already knew I would not find comfort there. Still, my feet carried me down the familiar road, past the mailbox dented from years of careless hits, past the swing that had rusted and creaked since my childhood. It was not a homecoming. It was a summons, one I could not ignore. The door opened before I knocked. My father stood there, his broad frame filling the doorway. His hair had gone grayer since I had last seen him, but his eyes still held the same hard edge I had grown up fearing. Behind him, my brother leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable, arms crossed like he was daring me to enter. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and the faint musk of old carpet. The living room looked exactly as I had left it years ago, down to the crooked picture of my parents' wedding on the wall. It was as if time had stopped here. Refusing to acknowledge the outside world. For a moment, silence stretched between us. Then I spoke. My voice was steady, though my chest trembled beneath the weight of what I carried. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't sell out our soldiers. Tell me the CID was wrong. My father's jaw tightened. He glanced at my brother, then back at me. You're blowing it out of proportion, he said, his tone flat, dismissive. It was just a few scraps, bits and pieces. Nothing important, nothing important. The words cut through me. I thought of the men who had died because positions had been leaked. I thought of the ambushes too precise to be accidents. I thought of the faces I had carried in my memory ever since Basra. You think classified troop movements are nothing important. You think the lives of soldiers are nothing. My brother shifted, pushing off the wall. We needed money, he said bluntly. Dad's pension wasn't enough. The bills kept coming. You don't know what it was like here while you were off playing hero. The word hero stung. Playing hero, I repeated, my voice breaking. I bled in the sand for this country. I pulled men out of fire. I buried friends. And you tell me it was just scraps, just money. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that people are dead because of you? My father's face hardened. We did what we had to do. You don't get it. You come back here with your medals and your scars, acting like you're the only one who's sacrificed. But we were left behind. No one cared how we scraped by. So yes, we sold some information, but we didn't pull the trigger. We didn't drop the bombs. My legs buckled and I sank into the old couch. Tears stung my eyes, hot and relentless. You didn't pull the trigger, but you loaded the gun. You gave them the map. You handed them the rope. Do you know what it feels like to look into the eyes of a dying man, knowing his blood is on the ground because someone betrayed him? That someone was you, my own family. Silence followed, heavier than any words. My brother looked away, shame flickering across his face for a fleeting second before he buried it beneath indifference. My father lit a cigarette, the flame bright for a moment before the smoke curled into the stale air. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than denial. I cried then, not just for the soldiers who had died, but for the girl I once had been, the daughter who had believed her family would always be her safe place. That illusion lay in ruins at my feet. When the knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate, none of us moved at first. Then my father cursed under his breath. The knock came again, louder this time. He stubbed out his cigarette and opened the door. Two men stood there, their suits crisp, their faces grave. Behind them I saw the glint of badges, FBI. Another pair of figures waited at the edge of the driveway, military police in uniform. The air outside buzzed with radios. Mr. Carter, one of the agents said, his voice clipped. We need you and your son to come with us. You are under investigation for espionage and aiding the enemy. My father did not argue. He did not slam the door or shout or protest his innocence. He simply nodded as if he had been expecting this moment all along. My brother's face went pale, his bravado evaporating in the presence of authority. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. The words espionage and aiding the enemy echoed in the small living room, filling every corner. They were not abstract anymore. They were not rumors or whispers. They were charges heavy with the weight of law and consequence. The agents read them their rights. My father remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. My brother muttered something about mistakes, about not meaning any harm, but the words fell flat. The cuffs clicked shut, metal on flesh. The final punctuation to years of lies. As they led my father and brother away, I stood in the doorway, the night air rushing past me. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, their whispers rising like a chorus. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was not part of it, that my blood was not theirs, but I said nothing. My silence was my shield, but also my prison. Inside, the house felt emptier than ever. The crooked wedding photo stared down at me, mocking the illusion of family that had once hung there. I sank back into the couch, my hands shaking. For the first time, I allowed myself to accept the truth. My family had betrayed not just me, but every soldier who had trusted their country to protect them. And no matter how much I loved them once, I could not excuse it. The next days blurred into a haze of interviews, questions, interrogations. FBI agents asked me to recount every letter I had written, every call I had made, every visit home. They showed me copies of emails I had never seen. Bank statements tied to accounts and names I did not recognize. The more evidence they laid out, the more the weight crushed me. My family's betrayal was larger, deeper, more calculated than I had feared. Still, the agents treated me as a witness, not a suspect. I was careful with my words, careful not to let my anger spill over into recklessness. Every answer mattered. Every detail was another stitch in the fabric of truth. I owed it to the men I had served with, to the ones who had not come home to speak with clarity, with honesty. But at night, when I was alone, I broke. I sat with the metal on the table before me, my reflection warped in its surface. I asked myself the same questions again and again. How had I not seen it? How had I trusted them? How could the people who raised me, the ones who taught me right from wrong, have chosen greed over honor? The answer was as bitter as it was simple. They had chosen themselves. And in choosing themselves, they had betrayed everything I had fought for. Still, even in my darkest hours, I clung to one truth. Their betrayal was not mine, their crimes were not mine, and though the world might try to paint me with their sins, I knew who I was. I was Evelyn Carter, soldier, survivor, daughter of traitors, yes, but not a traitor myself. And as the investigation deepened, as the courtroom loomed, I realized that this was not just their reckoning. It was mine too, because justice is not only about punishment, it is about truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, was the only weapon I had left. If you are still with me now, you will see how justice cuts both ways, how it demands a price from everyone it touches. And you will see how far I was willing to go to reclaim my name, even when the people who had stained it were the very ones I once called family. The morning after the arrests, the town paper carried a headline that turned my stomach. Local family accused of espionage. Beneath it was a grainy photo of my father and brother being led away in cuffs. My name was not in the headline, but it was buried in the article, tethered to theirs by blood alone. Reading it felt like being dragged underwater. Every word was a weight pulling me deeper into shame I did not deserve. I left the paper on the table and walked out to the porch. The neighborhood was alive with whispers. Curtains fluttered as eyes followed me. A neighbor across the street raised her hand in a hesitant wave, but the pity in her expression was worse than open accusation. I nodded stiffly and went back inside. I would not let them see me crack. Later that day, 2 FBI agents returned. They sat with me at the kitchen table, their notepads open, their pens ready. Their questions were careful but relentless. Had I ever overheard my father speaking with contacts? Had my brother ever asked me for details about troop movements? Did I know about offshore accounts linked to our last name? Each answer felt like walking a tightrope. I wanted to scream, to pound the table and tell them I had nothing to do with it, but emotion would not serve me here. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to answer calmly. Yes, I had written letters home. Yes, I had mentioned things that seemed harmless at the time. No, I had never imagined my words would be twisted into currency. When they finally left, I collapsed against the wall, my legs trembling. The line between witness and suspect felt paper thin. One wrong word, one misstep, and I could tumble from victim to accomplice in their eyes. I understood now that reclaiming my name would not come from medals or ceremonies. It would come from enduring every question, every shadow of doubt until the truth stood alone. In the weeks that followed, the investigation tore through every piece of my family's life. Boxes of documents were seized, computers were dismantled, bank records were scrutinized. I sat through interviews with Army investigators who laid out maps and timelines, showing me exactly how information had leaked, how ambushes had been orchestrated with chilling precision. Each red circle on the map marked a place where blood had spilled, where lives had been cut short, and each circle, they told me, was tied back to data my family had sold. I listened, fists clenched, tears burning my eyes. The guilt was not mine, but it lived inside me all the same. I could not stop picturing the faces of men I had served with, men whose deaths had been sealed not by enemy brilliance, but by my family's betrayal. When the trial began, the courtroom was crowded. Reporters filled the benches, their pens scratching furiously. Veterans came too, some to see justice served, others perhaps to glare at the daughter of the accused. My father sat at the defense table, his shoulders squared as if he were still in command of something. My brother looked younger than I had ever seen him, pale and drawn, his hands twitching as though he wanted to crawl out of his own skin. The prosecution laid out their case with brutal clarity. Evidence of financial transactions, encrypted communications traced to our home computer, documents that mirrored the very words I had once written in letters. They played recordings of intercepted calls. Voices low and calculated, speaking of troop routes as if they were weather forecasts. The jury shifted in their seats. The room grew colder with each revelation. When the defense spoke, they tried to soften the crime. They said my father had been desperate, my brother naive. They painted them as men caught in circumstances beyond their control. But desperation does not erase intent, and naivety does not undo blood spilled. I was called to testify. Hands trembled as I placed them on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. I looked at my father, then my brother. They would not meet my eyes. The questions came fast. Did you provide sensitive information? Did you know your letters were being used? Did you ever suspect your family of wrongdoing? No, I said again and again. My voice wavered, but I did not break. I wrote home as any soldier would. I trusted my family. I never believed they would betray that trust. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. The prosecutor let my words hang in the air before turning back to the jury. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the cruelest betrayal of all, to take the trust of a daughter of a soldier and turn it into profit. I stepped down from the stand, my knees weak, but inside me something shifted. Speaking the truth aloud under oath was like pulling a splinter from flesh. The wound remained. But at least the infection had a chance to heal. Verdict day arrived heavy with expectation. The jury filed in, faces solemn. I sat rigid, my hands clenched in my lap. My medal felt like a stone in my pocket, a reminder of the honor I had earned, now tangled with the disgrace of my bloodline. Guilty. The word rang out again and again. Guilty of espionage, guilty of aiding the enemy. My father's jaw clenched, but he showed no remorse. My brother sobbed, his shoulders shaking. I felt nothing at first, only a numbness that spread through my body. Then the tears came, quiet and unstoppable. They were not tears for the men who had been led away in chains. They were tears for the little girl who had once believed her family would never betray her. That girl was gone. Sentencing followed weeks later. My father received decades in federal prison. My brother, younger and less entrenched, received fewer years, but enough to steal the rest of his youth. The gavel struck, final and merciless. Justice, they called it, and in some ways it was. But justice does not mend the fractures of a heart. After the trial, I walked outside into the sunlight. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward me. Do you have anything to say about your family's sentence? One asked. I paused, the cameras fixed on me. Then I spoke. My family made their choices, and they will face the consequences of those choices. But I am not their crime. I am a soldier who served with honor, and I will not let their betrayal erase that. The words spread across headlines that night. Some praised me, others doubted me, but for once it did not matter. I had spoken the truth. In the quiet that followed, I returned to my own life, scarred but standing. The investigation had taken months, the trial longer. By the end of it, I was hollowed out, stripped down to something raw and unrecognizable. But slowly, I began to rebuild. I started attending support groups for veterans, places where silence could be broken without judgment. I found solace in the stories of others who had known betrayal, loss, the shattering of trust. Their courage reminded me that I was not alone, that survival itself was a form of defiance. At night, I still dreamed of Basra, of fire and blood, but I also dreamed of standing in that courtroom, speaking truth even when it hurt. Those dreams gave me strength. They reminded me that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the choice to keep moving through it. In time, I understood that my family's betrayal did not define me. It shaped me, yes, carved scars into my life, but it was not the sum of who I was. I was more than the daughter of traitors. I was a veteran, a survivor, a woman who had faced both war abroad and war at home and had not been broken by either. And so when I look back on those days now, I do not see only disgrace. I see the fire that forged me. I see the strength I never knew I had. And I see the unshakable truth that no betrayal, no matter how deep, can erase the honor of a life lived with courage. If you have followed me this far, know this: betrayal may break your heart, but it does not have to break your spirit. Justice may take time, but it arrives steady as the dawn. And in the end, the scars we carry are not marks of weakness. They are proof that we survived. They called me many names after the trial: daughter of traitors, soldier tainted by blood, a medal that should never have been awarded. Every headline was another lash across my back, every whisper in the grocery store another weight pressing me lower. It would have been easier to vanish, to let the shadows swallow me, to accept the world's verdict and disappear into silence. But I had not survived war, humiliation, and betrayal just to surrender to shame. The truth is, rebuilding your life after devastation does not happen in a single triumphant moment. It happens in small, stubborn steps. Waking up each morning when your body begs to stay in bed. Walking into town even when you know eyes will burn holes in your back. Holding your head high not because you feel strong, but because strength is the only shield you have left. I tried going back to school, but the stares followed me there too. Professors paused when they read my name on the roster. Students whispered as I passed. I withdrew before the semester ended. That night, staring at the ceiling in my tiny apartment, I realized something painful but liberating. I could not erase my last name, but I could redefine what it meant. That was when I decided to apply for a position I had once sworn I would never take: teaching at the Army training base, instructing new recruits. I had avoided it before because it felt like a demotion. Like moving from the battlefield to the classroom was a step backward. But now I saw it differently. Perhaps my battlefield was not only out there in the desert. Perhaps it was here too, in the minds and hearts of those who would soon carry rifles and march into the unknown. When I walked into that classroom for the first time, rows of wide-eyed recruits sat stiffly in their seats. Their faces were a mix of fear and determination, the same mix I had carried when I first donned the uniform. I introduced myself, Evelyn Carter. The room tensed at the last name. Some had clearly read the headlines. I did not flinch. "You've heard my name," I said, my voice steady. "You've heard the accusations. What you may not know is the lesson that came from it, and that is why I am here." I began to tell them about OPSEC, about the importance of operational security, about how seemingly harmless details can be strung together into deadly intelligence. I told them about letters, about trust, about betrayal. I did not shield them from the raw truth. Men had died because I trusted too easily. Lives had been lost because I had believed my family would never harm me. Their eyes widened, some swallowed hard, and in that silence I saw understanding bloom, not pity, not judgment, but the sharp realization that this was no textbook warning. This was lived experience, carved into my very bones. At the end of the session, one recruit raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "why are you still here after everything?" I looked at him, at all of them. "Because honor is not a medal pinned on your chest," I said softly. "It's the choice you make every day, and I refuse to let my family's betrayal steal my honor from me." The words hung in the air long after they left the room. For the first time in months, I felt something shift, not forgiveness, not healing, but purpose. Weeks turned into months. I taught class after class, watching new recruits march in, stumble, learn, and leave stronger. I became known not as the daughter of traitors, but as the instructor who spoke truth with scars to prove it. Slowly, the whispers faded. Slowly, respect returned. One evening, after dismissing a group, I lingered at my desk when I heard a timid knock at the door. I looked up to see a girl, barely 15, standing uncertainly in the hallway. Her eyes were the same shade of blue as my brother's. My chest tightened. "Sophie," I whispered, "my niece." She stepped inside. Her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hands twisting nervously. "Aunt Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know if I should come, but I had to. I rose slowly, unsure what to expect. The last I had seen of her was in the chaos of the trial, her face pale in the gallery, her mother gripping her hand tightly. "Why are you here?" I asked gently. Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I don't want to be like them," she blurted out. "I don't want to lie or cheat or pretend it was just for money. I want to live like you. I want to be strong. I want to do the right thing." The words cracked something open in me. For months I had carried the weight of a name I thought would forever be stained. And here, standing before me, was proof that legacy is not only what we inherit, but what we choose to carry forward. I reached for her, pulling her into a hug. She clung to me as if I were the only anchor she had left. "You don't have to be them." I whispered into her hair, "You can choose your own path, and if you want, I'll walk it with you." For the first time in a long time, I felt hope, not the fragile hope of denial, but the solid hope of renewal. My family had betrayed me, but from the ashes of that betrayal, something new was rising, a bond not built on blood alone, but on choice, on courage, on truth. That night, as I drove Sophie home, she looked out the window at the fading sunset. "Do you think people will ever stop calling us traitors?" she asked. I gripped the steering wheel, then smiled softly. "Maybe not, but their words don't get to decide who we are, we do." And as I said it, I realized it was not only for her, it was for me too, because honor is not something others can strip away. It is something you carry inside through every storm, through every betrayal, until it becomes the fire that lights your way forward. If you are listening, remember this. Even in the deepest ashes, life can spark again. Sometimes the family you lose clears the way for the family you find. And sometimes survival is not just about standing tall, but about helping the next generation rise taller still. The months after Sophie's visit marked the quiet turning point of my life. For so long I had lived in survival mode, bracing for the next blow, the next accusation, the next shadow of shame. But now something steadier began to grow. Not triumph, not vindication, but a steady current of belonging. It came from the recruits who listened with wide eyes and determined hearts. It came from my niece, who clung to me like a lighthouse in the storm. And it came unexpectedly. From within myself, from a part of me that had refused to die even when everything else had crumbled. Still, the world did not make it easy. I heard the whispers in grocery aisles. I caught the sidelong glances when I wore my uniform into town. Some people would never separate my name from my father's crimes, but slowly I learned not to carry their judgment. I could not control the way they saw me. I could only control the way I chose to live. One evening, after teaching a particularly grueling OPSEC session, a young woman from the class lingered behind. She reminded me of myself at 18, all nerves and fire hidden under stiff posture. "Ma'am," she said softly, "my brother told me not to enlist. He said I was too soft, but after hearing you speak, I think I can do this." Her words pierced straight through me. That was what I had wanted to hear my whole life, that women were not too soft, too fragile, too unworthy. That we had a place in the ranks, not because we were perfect, but because we were strong enough to stand anyway. I smiled and touched her shoulder. "You already proved him wrong," I said, "by showing up." That night, as I lay in bed, Sophie's words echoed in my mind too. "I don't want to be like them. I want to be like you." Those words had given me something my medals and titles never could. They had given me legacy. The following weekend, Sophie came back to visit. She brought her school books, her shy smile, and questions that tumbled out faster than I could answer. What was it like to march in formation? Did I ever feel afraid before a mission? How did I keep going when the world seemed too heavy? I answered her with honesty. I told her fear never disappears, you just learn to carry it. I told her the weight of betrayal never lifts completely, but courage grows in its shadow. I told her strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to get up one more time than you fall. Her eyes lit up with every word. And for the first time since the day of that brutal ceremony, I saw myself reflected not in shame, but in pride. In December, the training base invited me to give the keynote speech at a graduation ceremony. At first, I hesitated. Memories of my own ceremony, of humiliation unfolding under the spotlight, still haunted me, but I agreed. Not for me, but for them, the recruits about to step into the same fire I once walked through. The hall was packed that day. Rows of new soldiers sat in stiff uniforms, their families behind them. I stood at the podium, my heart hammering. For a moment, my throat tightened with the memory of another microphone, another crowd, another night that had nearly broken me. But then I saw Sophie in the front row, her small hands clapping eagerly, and I knew I could do this. I spoke not about medals or glory, but about truth. I told them that honor is not measured in applause, but in integrity. I told them that betrayal can come even from those you love most, but it cannot erase your worth. I told them that every detail matters, that carelessness costs lives, and that vigilance is a duty that never ends. When I finished, the room was silent. Then applause rose, steady and strong. It was not the frenzied applause of spectacle, but the deep, grounded respect of those who understood the weight of what had been said. After the ceremony, one of the commanders approached me. He was a stern man, his eyes sharp. "Carter," he said, "you turn disgrace into doctrine. That takes grit." Then, after a pause, he added, "And that is what makes you the kind of leader we need." I carried those words home like a shield. They were not absolution. They did not erase the past, but they gave me permission to stand tall in the present. That night, Sophie sat at my kitchen table, her notebook spread across the wood, her pencil scratching as she took notes on everything I had said. She looked up suddenly, her eyes serious. "Do you think I could ever wear the uniform, Aunt Evelyn?" I swallowed hard. The question carried both fear and hope. I saw in her the possibility of redemption, the chance for my bloodline to carve a different legacy. I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "You could," I said softly, "if it is what you truly want, but you don't have to prove yourself by enlisting. You prove yourself every day by choosing honesty, by standing for what's right. The uniform does not give you honor. You bring honor to the uniform." Her lips curved into a smile, shy and radiant all at once. "Then maybe one day I will," she whispered, and in that moment I knew my story had come full circle. I had once been the girl nobody believed in, mocked for daring to dream of service. I had been the soldier who bled, the veteran who carried scars, the daughter crushed under the weight of family betrayal. But now I was something else too, a guide, a witness, a living reminder that from ashes, life can rise again. The headlines have faded now. The whispers have quieted. The scars remain, but they no longer define me. What defines me is the sound of recruits marching past my window, the echo of Sophie's laughter in my home, the knowledge that I did not let betrayal steal my honor. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. We are not bound by the sins of our families. We are not condemned by the betrayals of others. We are more than our wounds. We are what we choose to become after them. I chose to rise, and so can you. So if you are here listening to my voice, I ask only this. Carry the lessons forward, guard what matters, cherish integrity like the lifeline it is, and when the world tries to break you, stand anyway. Because in the end, survival is not just about living. It is about refusing to let the fire consume you. It is about finding the strength to light the way for those who come after. And for me, that strength has a name. Sophie, the next generation, the promise that betrayal is not the final word. My story is not just one of ruin, it is one of rebirth, and that is how I will be remembered. In war, you know where the enemy stands. You train for it, you prepare for it, you face it head on. But in life, the sharpest wound comes when betrayal rises not from across the battlefield, but from the people sitting at your own table. That was the truth I had to learn. I lost a family I thought would protect me, but in losing them, I found something greater. I found my honor again, and I chose to stand with truth, even when it cost me everything else. What I learned is simple, but it cuts to the core. Blood is not always loyalty. Family is not always sacred. Honor is not given by a name, it is carved by the choices we make when no one is watching. My father and brother chose betrayal. I chose service, courage, and truth, and though their choices scarred me, they did not define me. The truth always comes into the light, even when it takes time. Justice is slow, but it does not forget. And from betrayal, there is still the chance to rise again. I became more than a soldier carrying scars. I became a teacher, a guide, someone who could turn pain into lessons that save lives. And in Sophie, my niece, I found proof that even in the ashes of betrayal, something good can grow. So hear me when I say this. Betrayal does not end you. It tests you. It breaks you down so you can rebuild stronger. You can rise. You can inspire. You can choose truth even when it costs you everything. If you believe true loyalty is forged by choice, not by blood, then like this video to show your support. And subscribe to Military Revenge so you never miss stories of honor, loyalty, and justice.